be talking about the last pirate of the West Indies, give you some of the background to kind of his family and how he ended up where he ended up. Talk about his piracy, and in between that we'll pause for a break, getting feedback about what you all know about piracy or what we think are myths versus truths. And then finally, his capture and then the memory of. So, as always, I am John Moore. I have a PhD in history from Tulane University in New Orleans. I've done archival research around the world. Diana and I did this together. I talked about that in one of my earlier talks. I'm an instructor at Loyola University and occasionally at Tulane University. And then I own and operate Broad Street Cider and Mead in New Orleans. I've got a couple talks on alcohol, one later today and then in the morning tomorrow. I like to give a little color as my cold open, and so I'll talk about being an instructor and piracy. You might think, John, do you just pick topics that are kind of clickbait? The answer is yes. It's easy, right? Because through piracy, and so I used to teach, it was world history, or global history is what they call it, but global history is kind of scattershot all over the place, talking about piracy as a module. So if you break up a class into 7 or 8 different topics, a lot of history professors might do different periods. I like to do things thematically. So kind of either beginning or ending with piracy. It matters if I want people to drop my class so I have less to grade, knowing laughter, or put it at the end if it's kind of a good memory, like, oh, that was so much fun. Most of my readings are in this kind of piracy, smuggling, counterfeiting vibe. In piracy I've used, so in my global class, I teach a war, what is the term? War in the modern era, something like that. I also have piracy, so I'll switch up the readings a little bit, but thinking about pirates and how we understand piracy can lead to things about, violence especially, control, thinking about how territories are managed, governments are set up, so much. There's a lot in there, and I have a great example here when I was putting together the talks. Essentially how this works is I'll come up with titles and say, oh, I want to do San Juan Pirates, I think it was Pirates and Art. That's what it's going to be on, because when I read about San Juan or how people approach it, oftentimes they'll give you this romanticized 1500s, 1600s, golden age of piracy. There's not a lot of documents though. There's not a lot of actual girth there. And so I kind of abandoned it when I put together the San Juan presentation that some of you saw yesterday. And then I realized, oh, I can't really change the title. I gotta find a pirate that I like, or that I want to talk about. And then I found this story, and I was like, oh, there's enough here. Actually, I can build an entire, it's about 30, 35 minutes, and then I imagine the Q&A is going to go a little bit longer this time, but we'll see. It's like, oh, there's a great amount of content. I even get to talk about the Habsburgs. Habsburgs, John, what are we doing? So in the Caribbean, why are we talking about the Habsburgs? And I warned you that I want to give a little bit of background to this pirate and his family and give you a little bit of understanding of how piracy operates on a larger scale. So the Habsburg Empire, why am I starting here? Multi-ethnic, multilingual Central European empire from about 1282 that dissolved in World War I. So Austria, Vienna was the capital. If you talk to Austrians today, there's this certain amount of shrug. Yes, we were an empire, but now we're a little teeny tiny spot. A lot of people kind of make fun of the Habsburgs for being inbred. They have very wide foreheads towards the end. There's a lot of cousins and uncles, and family tree is a straight line. But I love talking about the Habsburgs, and I love traveling there. Diana and I, great wine area. I want to begin though in Trieste. Anyone been to Trieste? Cool, actually. I haven't been there yet, so I'm looking forward to it. But Trieste is currently in Italy, and this map is kind of a zoomed in part of this was an earlier part, and then the Habsburg Empire expanded over the years. But Trieste here, if you notice, this yellow part is Istria, and this is Venice. So these weren't really added to the kind of Habsburg Empire until the 17 and 1800s. Trieste is really kind of 1330s, like one of the original territories of the Habsburg Empire. And you might think, oh, it's one of their coastal towns, it's going to be super important. But the Habsburgs were really a kind of land-based empire. If you want to split the world, European empires and empires in general, into two buckets, sea-based, land-based. They're definitely a land-based. So they kind of had a coastal town, but it was an imperial backwater. It was this kind of quaint little, if you've been to Istria, like Piran has the same feel, lots of places in Croatia, kind of like you can get little tiny boats in and out, but not major ports. It's not a major area. And so you have this town of Trieste, an imperial backwater, until you get to Charles VI and his daughter Maria Theresa. There's a series of wars in the 1700s as well. But what they bring is granting Trieste a free port status. Again, teaching in this modern era, teaching now versus 10 years ago, I don't need to talk to you about tariffs. It's kind of in the news. Knowing laughter again, thank you. Trieste, 1719, and then essentially 1740, they expanded it to the port, New City and Old City. It still actually operates as a free port. It's a tariff-free port, and it's why it is still today the main kind of trading port and import-export of Italy. And so this sparked growth, immigrant groups, so you have Italians, Serbians, Slovenians, Croats, Jews, and Greeks. They introduced freedom of worship, and then all of these groups could actually negotiate freely. In some periods and in some cases, women of kind of landed nobility had the same rights as men of landed nobility. So it's kind of, if you had property, you can engage in contracts. This is very important to facilitate trade. Why are you talking about trade, John? We're going to get to pirates, right? I'm going to get there. So other things they did, infrastructure-wise, building in kind of canals and entryways so that you can get larger and larger ships moving in and out of the port. This is also extremely important. So this was built in 1756 during the Habsburg period, and so this allowed boats to travel directly into the city center for the first time. This sparks a trade boom, both in legal and illegal trade. So I want you to think about piracy and smuggling, all of these things, so there's kind of in the gray area. So there's two ways to run kind of a hustle if you are engaged in illegal trade. One way is to kind of carry on or piggyback on a large legal trade network. So if there's lots of trade going around, it's easy to kind of fold in either, in some cases, dodging tariffs or bringing in black and gray market goods. This is where we get to the Kupferstein family's coat of arms, 1549 here. So this is one family. They're originally from Prague, which is part of the Habsburg Empire at this point. And the paternal patriarch, Cristoforo Kupferstein, received a recognition and coat of arms from Ferdinand I of Austria and eventually moved to Trieste in the mid-1500s. His last name was probably adapted from the town of Kufstein, which is in current-day Austria. It's in between Innsbruck and Graz. After their arrival, the family became Trieste's early settlers, rose to prominence, and eventually became the city's wealthiest. Our pirate, so his name Cofresi, and I'll get there, his father, Francesco Giuseppe Fortunato von Kupferstein, lots of Italian, some amount of German food, and I'll talk a little bit about that, was actually forced to leave Trieste after he killed a rival in 1778. So thinking back to this period. So family moved here when it was kind of a backwater, rose to prominence when there's kind of free port status and this kind of infrastructure development. And then you have this kind of son who he got, so it was probably in a duel, and both he and the person he killed both worked at a criminal court. You might think that's a little weird, but if you're going to be a smuggler, if you're going to be in kind of gray markets, it's actually nice to know if the authorities are going to go after you. And one of the best ways to do that is to become the authorities yourself. This will also be a theme in this talk. And so his name and those of 4 others became linked to the murder. He was convicted in absentia, and then he remained, however, in touch with his family. So he flees, Daddy flees, eventually finding himself to Cabo Rojo. So where Francisco Kufferstein eventually becomes Francisco Cofresi. So he Hispanicizes his name. So his middle part becomes from Giuseppe to Jose as well. So via Barcelona, so he flees Trieste, goes into a duel, flees Trieste, gets to Barcelona, eventually finds himself to Cabo Rojo by 1784. Harbor town, he was accepted by the local aristocracy with a Spanish honorific Don of noble origin. And this is when he changed his name. So it made his neighbors easier for them to pronounce his name, helped him blend in a lot easier. There is, in this kind of 1700s, if you read about characters, people change their names pretty frequently, sometimes nefariously, right? If you're gonna hide from people, it's easier to kind of change your name. Sometimes it's just you're operating in different languages. You might speak not fluently, but 3 or 4 languages. You can kind of operate, especially if you're in trade networks. And that's what's going on here. So why Cabo Rojo? So we were in San Juan. Up here is the administrative capital, essentially where it's a military fortification. You're not gonna have that many people on the islands. It was in the kind of few thousands, really up to the late 1700s. And then in the early 1800s, Spanish policy changed and essentially said, we want a lot of settlers, and this is part of this larger story. So eventually the father, so I was still talking about our pirate's father. He was pardoned for these earlier murders, and so he could have gone back to Trieste, but it sounds like he actually didn't. So why then move to this area if you're in the gray markets? So because he was linked to legal commerce in his homeland, Francisco probably relocated here for strategic reasons. Again, the harbor was very far away from San Juan, and then also these kind of craggy cliffs, little inlets. You have to have local knowledge, otherwise you might break up your ship on these kind of rocks, and it's very difficult to move around. And so he met a woman of noble background, married, and had Roberto, our eventual pirate, in 1791. So moving to Roberto's early life, some accounts of his life indicate that his father died when he was only 4 years old. It might have been his mother, it might have been both. But in either case, Roberto was known to have grown up with only his sister and his 2 brothers in the household, so it's kind of a rough upbringing. So he's interested in sailing from a young age, and he even had a small boat named El Mosquito. He married Juana Krestov, another kind of strange last name we might think, around 1820. She was either likely born of Dutch, she was probably of Dutch heritage, and then might have been born on Puerto Rico, or she might have been from Curacao and moved there. So we talked about the Dutch influence in Curacao and people moving on. Their first son, also Francisco, died, so named after Daddy, died when he was only 4 months old. He lost another son in infancy, but he had a daughter named Maria in 1822. So it's possible when Cofresi eventually leaves Puerto Rico to take up buccaneering, he never saw his wife or daughter again. I wanted to, before we take a break and then actually talk about his piracy, give you an idea of the geopolitical situation in the 1820s. So Puerto Rico was a colony of Spain during Cofresi's lifetime. However, in the wake of the American Revolutions, 1776, many British and Spanish colonies in South and Central America began seeking independence from their imperial overlords. Afraid of losing Puerto Rico, a valuable and strategic trading and military port, Spain began removing assets from the island via large merchant ships. So what you have going on, so Mexico 1821, Central's 1823, 1830s, this kind of all of these wars of independence. How this works is these countries or newly established republics would issue letters of marque, which is a type of legal piracy. So a cheap and easy way to fight a war back then is to say, hey, you want to be a legal pirate for me? Here's this fancy paper, go hunt down these other people. And so during these wars of independence in the 1810s, 1820s, 1830s, it gets very murky as far as who's who in the zoo when you're kind of floating around, because people would be traveling under different flags. We see this again in the Venezuelan tanker. If anyone goes reading up on that, they were traveling under false flags, so they pretended to be Guyana, which is right next door. So same game. Traveling under false flags, privateering going on, so it's really gumming up trade networks. And if we think back to Cabo Rojo, the map here, this is very much not even secondary, like a fourth-rate port. It's kind of important just based on its territory, like it's on the corner of the island, but trade is mostly flowing through the main port in Puerto Rico. So what's going on in the southern part is if trade is coming out, they're having even less and less importance. And so this is what sparks this almost need for living in this very craggy, kind of hilly, limestoney, moving towards an idea of piracy. And I'll move towards that after we talk a little bit. I always like to take a little bit of a break and have everyone chat amongst each other for about 90 seconds. This should be relatively fun though. So what do you know about pirates? What do you think you know about pirates? You might have gone to a piracy talk before. What do you think are myths versus truths? And of course, I'll tell the best pirate joke as we get there, hopefully. So chat amongst each other for about 90 seconds, and then we'll come back together. Want to help me out? We'll start either way. Myths, truths, what do you know about pirates? Yes, please.
Ari.
I thought they were kind of traders who didn't obey any laws whatsoever, just for what they wanted.
Yeah, so the comment was thinking that they're traders that don't obey any laws at all. So, and we'll talk about kind of the legal implications of it. So oftentimes people they had a business card, they didn't, but it wouldn't just say pirate, it might also say trader, it might kind of in commerce, it might say government agent too. So oftentimes people weren't proud of being pirates, it was just, or boastful. It was, they would hide, right? They're criminals oftentimes. So they kind of would hide in either shadows or out in the open, pretending to be something else. Perfect. Anyone else want to? Yes, please.
I think the lifespan of a pirate wasn't that long. I think they were pirates 2-3 years. Wasn't that profitable?
Yes.
And they don't really talk much about how many female pirates there were.
Yeah, so the comment was it's a fairly short lifespan, so sometimes maybe 2 or 3 years, and we'll actually see here with our example, it's exactly 3 years, so he's perfectly on average, we're all average, right? He's right there. And then role of female pirates, and there's some scholarly work to that, and also the kind of violence involved is part, and that most were not very successful, right? It's also, what, Freakonomics, did anyone read that book like 20 years ago? It was an economist talking, one of the chapters was on the illegal drug trade. And you think like, oh, drug, if you're gonna go sell drugs on the street, you make a lot of money. No, most of them don't. Most of them would be better off just working at Reebok or McDonald's or whatever. There's a very small, it's kind of one of those hustles where there's a very small amount of people making a good amount of money, whereas the vast majority, it doesn't work out. And piracy, absolutely, and we'll see that here too. Anyone want to help me with, what do we think are myths? Yes, please. The question was Sir Francis Drake a pirate? If you are English, no. If you are Spanish, yes. And that gets into the legal gray area part, right? And we're seeing that conversation with this oil tanker business in Venezuela. There's Venezuelans just saying, oh, the Americans are pirates. This is an act of piracy. There's some legal justification, a little bit, it's a little ropey. Whereas on our side, we on the American side, absolutely not. So some of that is who you're talking to, but if you really want to get kind of in the 1700s, 1800s, if you have letters of marque, this kind of contract from a government entity that says, please go be a legal privateer for me, it is piracy. If another country doesn't acknowledge that, then they try you as a pirate. So the answer is yes and no. Thank you. Yes,
I was going to say, I feel like we are living in piracy right now. I tend to believe Venezuela is correct.
Yeah, I mean, so there is the question of like, oh, current situation, it does feel a little bit of like piracy, and yes, and it matters how you market or how you frame it. There's legal justifications. Maritime law is extremely complicated. Is anyone in maritime law by chance? New Orleans, we actually have, because we are in Napoleonic Code, we're the one state that has that, so we don't follow English common law. So a lot of people actually go to Tulane, for example, has a very large maritime law. Because you learn both English common law and Napoleonic Code, which is more of a continental European model, because it gets extremely complicated, and how you frame these things and package them. What are some myths? Does anyone want to, kind of the Disney. Lafitte's? Yeah. Yeah, so Lafitte was an American hero on one side, so again, talking about New Orleans, kind of was involved in the Battle of New Orleans, 1815, which is a battle that never should have happened because the peace treaty was already signed, and yada, yada, yada. But so sometimes pirates end up essentially on the right side of history, but he was definitely more of a smuggler, if we want to think of it. Oftentimes, people were smuggling in the times when I was talking about free port status. You smuggle goods to get away from tariffs. So if you are bringing in, for us, we bring in apple juice. So if I wanted to say, oh, there's tariffs on them now, I want to try to get away from that to save 20% or whatever the tax is. That's a form of smuggling. Pirates would be involved in that, right? What are some of the Disney myths? I can run through them, but
They have a good time.
they have a good time is one of them. Yo-ho, yes, please.
Yeah,
Parrots on the shoulder. Does anyone know where most parrots on the shoulder have a good time, yo ho ho, and a bottle of rum, yada yada yada? Do we know who we want to blame? Captain Cook, a little bit. Anyone?
Jack Sparrow.
Jack Sparrow. There's a certain author.
Robert Louis
Yes,
Stevenson.
thank you in the back here. Robert Louis Stevenson. Thank you so much. So, Scottish guy. I think it was his kid or his nephew he was laying there sick because it's the Victorian period, that's what people did. And the child is very bored, so he tells him this very romanticized story, and that's where we get most of our kind of Disney type understanding of piracy. It's just kind of Long John Silver, these very gregarious characters. And most of it, again, it's thinking back to it's violence. There's not a lot of time. Most people are not great at it. It doesn't work out. We'll see that here. Great, thank you all so much. Anyone else? Cool. So then let's walk through get actually to our pirates. So Robert Cofresi, here he is, modern interpretation. So initially was kind of a land-based pirate. If we go back to these pictures, so Cabo Rojo, it's a territory that's separated by mountains before you get to the coast. So when you have mountains, there's very few pathways to kind of get in and out. If you are in the kind of robbing people game, you go to where the people are, right? I always like to say in New Orleans, if I'm like, I'm gonna start robbing people, I don't do it at my local supermarket, I go to Bourbon Streets. You just bump into people and they'll just like, bags of money will fall out because they don't know what they're doing. No, and so that's what's going on here. He likely started, yes?
Is that, what is that for reference? Is that a castle, that white dot?
This white dot, I'm actually not sure on that. I think it's just a house. Yeah, it's not, it's kind of an underdeveloped area. The question was, what was that white kind of building in the middle there? But getting back to our pirate, so he likely started with gangs on land, robbing convoys, traders, and of course, government officials. So when he took to piracy around age 25, he initially targeted the merchant voyages bound for Spain. So when I was talking about Spain divesting itself from Latin American countries, so this is some of the big prizes that were going on. So although there are persistent rumors, Cofresi was a Robin Hood type who brought his plunder to his homeland and shared it with the poor. All he was doing was just kind of going into trade markets. So if you have to have a fence. So if you steal stuff, you have to sell it somehow. In Cabo Rojo, he had this kind of family background, still known as a Don, even though his family actually did very poorly. So this is why he turned to fishing and then eventually into kind of piracy. And so there's stronger evidence that he was just more interested in robbing and murdering for personal gain than the philanthropic redistribution of wealth. Again, he's only active for about 3 years or so he's a perfect example of pirate during this era. So he used a variety of different ships. He would kind of steal a ship, burn a ship, steal a ship, burn a ship, like kind of had to move around. His last one is a prototype of what types of ships he was using. So it's the Anna or Anne. Small, quick vessels, speed over power. So this is this one, and then this is an American battleship, and I'll get to that. His most famous is the sloop Anne. So he attacked trade routes around Puerto Rico, Hispaniola. So this is where we're traveling right now. So hopefully he's still not around. Okay. And St. Thomas. He moved quick, get out quick. That's the game of being a good pirate, is not getting caught. So you don't want to be the strongest, you want to be the quickest out there. So you had a small crew about 10 to 20 people, generally about 15 is the idea. Most or all of whom were Puerto Rican sailors and pirates. During his brief career, he plundered at least 8 ships and attacked many more. So according to legend, he was an exceptionally strong and capable captain. His crew apparently admired and respected him, and there are no known threats of mutiny aboard the Anna. We talked a little bit about violence, and the important thing to note here as a pirate captain is that this is where he really went wrong, and this is the romanticized version of what's going on as Robin Hood I really can't get a hold of, and it's hard for me to be like, because what he would do, he would capture vessels, and he would say, oh, are you Puerto Rican? Would you like to join my crew? Everyone else, you all die. It was like the level of violence is actually kind of extraordinary. And I want to tell you why that's a bad idea. If you go into piracy, which you probably shouldn't, but the best thing about piracy, or the very kind of the pirates that stuck around, using violence as a threat works great because you want people as witnesses. Oh, this pirate came, they murdered kind of one of the guys we didn't like anymore, one of the officers, whatever. And then they left us all alone, maybe adrift, maybe they kind of injured our ship so we couldn't chase after them exactly right then, but we were able to repair and we tell the story. This, on the South China Sea, I like to assign an article where a historian who was University of Macau was talking about pirates in the South China Sea. That was their hustle. They essentially had a brand as a pirate. When you saw their ship, you're like, man, they caught up to us. Sucks for some of the officers, but we're gonna be okay as the crew, and we're actually not gonna fight them, because if we fight them, they're gonna attack us back. On the pirate end, that works out, it's an HR nightmare. Imagine constantly saying like, all right, everyone, we're gonna go into battle. It's kind of rough, very handheld. They had cannons, but movies romanticize this. It's very bloody, long, kind of hand-to-hand combat, where you got a 50-50 shot. So if you're like, all right, there's 20 of us, about 10 of us are gonna die, and we don't even know what's on the ship anymore, then it's actually, you burn through people very quickly. And this is what Kofrasi was doing. He was not very smart of being a pirate. So he also, when I say probably ate, we actually don't know, because he would oftentimes plunder. Sometimes he would steal the ship itself and it would be found later on with the crew members missing. That's the 8 that we know about. He would oftentimes just kill everyone, sink the ship. Either make them walk the plank. There was one instance where he made them all walk the plank, but they were all good swimmers. It happened to me. I think they were Danish, maybe was a weird wrinkle. And then most of the crew survived. And then they told the authorities, and the authorities were like, wait, this is what's going on with all the missing ships? Like, so violence as a tool of kind of propaganda makes sense, but what Kofrasi was doing was next level. He also had copycats who were like, oh, this guy's kind of able to do this hustle, this is gonna be great for me, I'm not gonna be as violent. And they would meet up, have a beer every once in a while, be like, Roberto, what is going on with the murdering everyone? That's not smart. And that was just part of his game. But, so that is the one thing we know. The level of brutality was alarming even to other pirates, and then only Puerto Ricans and were able to be permitted to live, or if you had a background in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There was a story of someone who, his father was from Prague, yada, 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 similar last name. He's like, oh, you're cool, like you're fine, like you're part of my people too. And so this danger that he posed was a physical one, and it became a matter of international concern. Because this is why. So Cabo Rojo, I showed you on the little map just to kind of confuse you initially. If you circle out, you have Haiti and San Domingo, or Dominican Republic today, so Hispaniola, St. Croix, so these are British Virgin Islands, and the Danish Virgin Islands, and then American vessels are the other kind of trading vessels going in and out. So he starts picking off vessels of other territories. So he begins on these kind of Spanish merchant vessels where they're taking goods out of the area, and then he expands his operation to others. So it becomes an international concern. So he also showed how Spain had an inability to protect Puerto Rico, even from its own kind of, he had very small ships. He was only working on coastal waters. He shouldn't have been able to get away with, even for 2 or 3 years. So the Spanish governor of Puerto Rico, it's this constant, there's different characters involved in his backstory, but one of them is kind of a second tier judge, eventually becomes governor, sub-governor. So he has these kind of people going out for him that built several lookout points along the southern coast of Puerto Rico, and then hunted down the other pirates who mimicked Kofrasi's actions. So numerous Spanish and American warships are also looking for him and searching for Kofrasi. one of these kind of characters, I try not to give you too many dead old white guys, but this one, Captain John Sloat, has an interesting story. He was appointed midshipman of the Navy in 1800, sailed and had accommodation or kind of promotions during the War of 1812, and captured HMS Macedonia during that war, so a British ship. He then commanded the schooner Grampus, great name, Grampus, 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 during which, in March of 1825, he's hunting down the pirate Cofresi. So later in life, interesting enough, anyone from California, he commanded the Pacific Squadron before the Mexican-American War in 1846 and engaged in a skirmish called the Battle of Monterey, California, raising a flag over the customs house there and claiming California to the United States. So he was actually the first military governor of California, and it was only about 22 days. It was kind of one of those like, dibs, this is mine, okay, I'll go away. But if you've ever been to Monterey, when I was doing background on this, I was like, I know that guy. I'm probably, Diana's mom lives in the area, and we've actually been to the customs house there. So getting then into the battle, so the Spanish are humiliated. They have to go to the Danish and asking for their help. They're essentially like, I am so sorry, we've got a lot going on. Can you help us find this guy? I know it's our problem, but I'm so sorry. And then even more distressing, they have to go to the Americans and say, you two, can you help us? So multinational force comes out. Captain John Sloat is one of the kind of leaders at this point. So Sloat and the Grampus arrived in Puerto Rico with a small fleet of warships, probably only about 3 or 5 ships altogether. His plan was to ambush Cofresi by he disguised the Grampus as a merchant vessel. So instead of being a kind of a small warship, described it as a merchant vessel, pretended that it had problems, so it was limping along the coast and essentially waiting for Cofresi to come out and try to attack. And so this happens. Cofresi comes out, Diana then starts firing at the Grampus, Cofresi realizes too late the error of his ways, and so is handily beaten during the fight because he has a small kind of fast ship, only one main gun really, versus this warship. And so the Anna sank off the coast of Puerto Rico, kind of a southern part, so his base was over here and he kind of found himself over here, and crew went ashore, split into 2 parts. However, the Spanish, again, were waiting for them, and so saw this all happen. Pirates hid in the woods, and then eventually was captured. He might have been able to escape altogether, but the Spanish kind of overloaded their military presence. So was captured by the Spanish in Bucaram Beach. It's a very pretty place to have your last stand, right? Lots of his men died in the battle, and most of the others were injured. He and his remaining men were captured and then imprisoned where we were earlier, so at Del Moro. So the main kind of prison is also going to be here on the island. So moved, only has a 1-day trial. It's a little bit of a show trial. The Americans aren't happy about it because they're like, hey, we helped capture him. We want to also put him on trial in our territories. The Spanish essentially wanted to be done with him. He tried to bribe his way out, naturally, but he was sentenced to death, executed by firing squad. One of the apocryphal stories is, I've murdered hundreds of men, I know what death looks like, fire away. Maybe wasn't as romanticized, but his body was publicly displayed as a warning to other pirates. He is buried just outside he was probably executed right outside the field. He might have been executed in town. There's different stories. I'm pro field on this one because if you miss, it just goes into dirt instead of buildings. But buried next to, I talked to this very beautiful cemetery. If anyone walked around the DePazzi's cemetery, buried outside the wall of it though, because you couldn't be buried in a cemetery if you were a criminal. However, then moving into kind of this memory, I've shown this before if you were here for my earlier talk, Look at that. Don't you want to be remembered as like the yoked 22-year-old version of yourself? He's about in his late 20s when he dies. But Cabo Rojo eventually builds a statue, not until 1991. It only gets 3.5 stars on Google. It's not very well traveled. It's in this kind of swamp area and you still have to pay for it. Doesn't really make sense. A monument was in his honor on Boquerón Beach eventually, where his men were captured, and the city of Cofresi in the Dominican Republic was also named in his honor. All of these things really happened mostly in the kind of 1970s, 1980s, 1990s as marketing tools, where it's like, oh, people like pirates and piracy, let's just talk about our local pirate, even though he was a horrible, horrible person. So this is, again, this kind of marketing versus reality, because so much violence is going on. There have been a few pieces of music and literature in Spanish written about him, but mostly it's kind of tapered away as people have done more archival research and realized it's one of those, oh, sometimes piracy is up to interpretation. No, he just murdered a lot of people for no good reason, and he wasn't very smart about it, but here we are. Citations, I used a lot of academic works on this one actually. Some were in Spanish. This Robert Means one was pretty hilarious. So when I was talking about Cofresi's kind of heritage and his father especially moving from being Italian and kind of German speaking, moving to the island, this guy was very grumpy about it, saying like, some scholars say he's Italian and some say he's German. I think they're two different people. I'm like, oh, you're so wrong, because it's the same person. It's a very complicated kind of relationship to background. But I also like to point out I've only got a couple more talks. Got rums later on, and then alcohol industry. I've got some kind of high notes I want to hit tomorrow, and then everything else you can see on your TVs if you want to listen to me. And I also like to end with philosopher Simone Weil, writing in 1942, "Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity." And you've given me some of that today, so I thank you very much. If you see Diana and I around for the next couple of days, so feel free to say hello. We love chatting, and have a good rest of your morning. Thank you.
Oh, you promised a pirate joke.
Oh, pirate joke. Yeah, apologize. What is a pirate's favorite letter? C. Oh, you know the joke. Usually people say R, and no, it's the C they love. Yeah, that's the best.